Tonight, this story follows how perhaps 30 to 40,000 Roman and Allied soldiers survived a migrating host, remembered as far larger, by the end. The victory will make sense without invented speeches or impossible certainty. Was Marius saved by preparation, terrain, or one decision to wait? Late in the summer of 102 BC, the road beyond the Roman camp disappeared beneath a moving population. From the walls, the first men saw armed groups approaching through the dust. More followed behind them. Wagons appeared among the warriors, then livestock, families, servants and carts, carrying the possessions of people who had spent years on the road. As the column passes the Roman walls, decide what you would have ordered, attack before it escapes, or remain inside and risk appearing afraid. Leave your choice in the comments, then keep it in mind as Marius makes his own. Ancient writers imagined the host in the hundreds of thousands. Their figures cannot be accepted as an exact count. The column was still large enough to occupy the road for days, and its visible size presented Marius with a problem that no reliable number could solve for him. The Roman army inside the defences may have contained roughly 30 to 40,000 Roman and Allied troops. It was a considerable force by the standards of the Republic. Beside the migration outside, it seemed small. The Teutons did not halt for a formal siege. Their main movement continued south, while armed men came close to the palisade and challenged the Romans to leave it. Plutarch preserves one of the taunts, shouted toward the camp. The Teutons asked whether the soldiers had messages for their wives, since they expected to reach Italy first. Later retelling may have polished the wording, but the insult had a practical purpose. They wanted the Romans outside. Marius would not give them that kind of battle. The first surprise is that the battle was not won when the Romans charged. It began taking shape while they stood still, watching an enemy that seemed too large to fight. For years his men had trained under the shadow of Arausio, marching under heavy loads and building fortified camps until the ordinary work of keeping an army together became familiar. Even so, standing behind timber while an enemy mocked them within sight was difficult. The order was still obeyed. The first view from the walls seemed to confirm the worst rumours. Experienced warriors walked beside a column whose end could not be seen, and captured Roman weapons appeared among unfamiliar shields. Every estimate looked too small against the road itself. Closer observation gradually weakened some of the fear. Tired families walked beside overloaded wagons. Animals strayed from the route and had to be recovered. Different groups moved at different speeds. The host remained dangerous, but it possessed the ordinary limits of people travelling with everything they owned. Marius kept the army inside because those limits had not yet produced an advantage he could use. A force on the march could look disordered while still placing many thousands of warriors in battle. If the Romans attacked the passing column, they would have to leave prepared defences and move onto ground chosen by necessity rather than judgment. The Teutons could concentrate against them, while other parts of the migration continued arriving. The soldiers watched instead. Plutarch says the column passed for 6 days. The number may be rounded, as ancient authors often used duration to express the size of an army they could not count. It nevertheless conveys the length of the movement and the pressure placed on the Roman camp. The road remained occupied through repeated guard changes. Men who watched one section in the morning could return later and find different wagons still moving south, with wheels, animals, and voices continuing in the background. The arrangement of the migration became easier to read. Armed groups did not form a continuous body. Wagons and families separated them. While the front advanced through country, the rear would not reach for hours. Marius did not need the soldiers to believe the Teutons were weak. He needed them to see the enemy clearly enough to follow orders when the battle finally came. The migrating people continued toward Aquae Sextiae, a Roman settlement known for its springs. Neither the exact route nor the location of the later battlefield remain uncertain. The surviving accounts preserve hills, wooded ground, and access to water. but they do not provide a map precise enough to identify every position. When the last part of the column passed, Marius prepared to follow. The Roman army would move more quickly than the wagon host if it avoided the most crowded road. Scouts and local guides could keep contact while the legions used nearby tracks. The distance ahead would become important because the migration could not remain equally concentrated throughout its length. Waiting did not mean surrendering the initiative. The Teutons continued stretching their movement across the country, while the Roman force stayed together under one command. Rome had lost precisely that control 3 years earlier near Arausio. The memory of the disaster stood behind every order Marius gave. In the autumn of 105 BC, 2 Roman armies faced the migrating coalition near Arausio, on the Rhein. A common enemy required a single command. Yet political rank and personal hostility kept the 2 Roman forces apart. The consul Gaius Marius. Maximus came from a family without the prestige expected by the older Roman nobility. The proconsul Quintus Servilius Scipio belonged to an established patrician house and refused to accept the authority of a man he considered socially inferior. Surviving accounts disagree over the placement of the camps and the negotiations that preceded the battle. On the central failure, however, they are consistent. A large enemy stood nearby while the Roman forces remained divided. The Cimbri and their allies may have attempted negotiation. Ancient sources suggest that they wanted land, although Roman writers often presented such requests only to show why compromise was impossible. Rome had settled defeated peoples before, but it did not treat an armed migration as an equal partner entitled to choose territory. Keep the failure about to unfold in mind. 3 years later, Marius will reverse it with an army smaller than the migrating host. Yet the decisive opening will come neither from a formal battle plan nor a heroic speech. It will begin when ordinary camp workers go downhill for water. Scipio feared that Marius might receive the credit if the crisis ended through agreement or a joint victory. He moved against the enemy without achieving reliable coordination with the consul. The divided Roman armies were then defeated in succession. Ancient casualty figures reach 80,000 soldiers and tens of thousands of attendants. Those totals are probably exaggerated, and the sources may have combined citizens, allies, servants, and camp followers in different ways. The battle was still among the worst defeats in Roman history. Once the Roman formations broke, the river and the camps became traps. A disciplined army could retreat through assigned routes if its officers retained control. At Arausio, separate commands and collapsing units crowded the same ground. Men who discarded equipment moved faster for a time, but they also became unable to defend themselves. The enemy reached the camps, where supplies and non-combatants added to the confusion. Few details about individual units survived. The scale of loss was remembered more clearly than the sequence that produced it. News of the defeat travelled rapidly into Italy. Rome had experienced military disasters before. Hannibal had destroyed Roman armies during the Second Punic War, and the Republic had survived. Arausio revived an older fear because the enemy came from the north. The direction associated with the Gallic capture of Rome centuries earlier, the migrants did not immediately cross the Alps. The northern crisis would not end with this one migration route. The Cimbri would later test Rome from the eastern Alps, and a future film will follow that second campaign through to Vercelli. For now, the road turns west, giving Marius time he did not yet know he had. They turned west and continued through Gaul toward the Iberian Peninsula. Their decision gave Rome time, although no Roman leader could know how long the delay would last, or whether the coalition would return by another route. Scipio was prosecuted and punished, while Marius lost political standing. Rome could argue over blame, but the argument replaced none of the soldiers who had died. Rome needed another army and a commander who could keep it together. Gaius Marius had recently completed the war against Jugurtha in North Africa. He came from Arpinum, rather than the traditional ruling families of Rome, and his political rise had already created powerful enemies. His military record made those objections less persuasive during an emergency. He was elected consul for 104 BC, his third consulship, and received responsibility for the northern threat. He then remained consul through an extraordinary series of consecutive elections from 104 to 100 BC. Later tradition made this period the setting for a complete transformation, known as the Marian Reforms. That phrase is convenient, but misleading when treated as one organized package, introduced at a single moment. Marius did recruit citizens with little or no property. He reduced unnecessary baggage and expected soldiers to carry more of their own equipment. Training, camp construction, and long marches received sustained attention under his command. Many of these practices had earlier precedents. Property requirements had changed before Marius, poor citizens had served in earlier emergencies, and Roman armies had long constructed fortified camps. The reforms associated with his name developed within a military system already adapting to longer wars and wider recruitment. Success in Gaul did not require Marius to invent an entirely new legion. He gave existing Roman methods enough consistency to survive a difficult campaign. The army trained while the migration remained far away. Soldiers marched with weapons, tools, food, and stakes used in building defences. A smaller baggage train allowed the force to travel more rapidly and reduced the number of carts that could block a road. A completed march did not end the day's work. A ditch and rampart gave tired troops protection during the night. The regular plan of a Roman camp placed units, stores, animals, and headquarters where men expected to find them. Familiarity mattered when darkness or alarm reduced the time available for explanation. Supply demanded the same sustained attention. Near the mouth of the RH, Marius ordered work on the canal, later called the Fossa Mariana. The project improved access between the river and the Mediterranean, where shallow channels made navigation difficult. It supported the army and later benefited regional trade. The canal did not decide Aquae Sextiae by itself. It helped Marius keep a large force supplied while he waited for an enemy whose route remained uncertain. Waiting lasted longer than any battle. Reports placed the migrants in Gaul and Spain before they eventually turned back. Marius maintained training and discipline through years in which political opponents could question why the army remained in the field. When reliable news finally arrived, the coalition had divided. The Cimbri moved toward the eastern Alps. The Teutons and Ambrones advanced through southern Gaul toward the Roman position. The mistakes at Arausio remained close to every decision Marius made. His forces stayed under one command, and he refused to let the enemy determine when the fighting would begin. Long before the Teutons came within sight of Marius's camp, reports of their journey had reached Rome in fragments. Merchants and soldiers carried different versions, while communities in Gaul passed along stories drawn from encounters that may have lasted only a few hours. By the time those accounts reached Italy, the people described in them were difficult to separate from the fear surrounding them. Roman writers usually grouped the Teutons with the Cimbri and Ambrones. The names appear clearly enough in the surviving histories, though the relationship between these peoples is less certain. The groups fought as allies during parts of the migration, and sometimes followed the same route, but they need not have formed a permanent nation under one ruler. Their coalition could change on the road as smaller groups joined for protection, and later left when their interests diverged. The Romans had little interest in recording those internal arrangements accurately. They wanted to know whether the newcomers were hostile, and how many warriors they could place in the field. Details about kinship or leadership mattered only when they affected a campaign. The origins of the Cimbri and Teutons were already uncertain in antiquity. Later Roman authors connected them with the distant north. Some placed their homelands near the Northern Sea, in regions that modern readers often associate with Jutland or nearby territories. Other ancient accounts treated them more generally as Germanic or Celtic peoples. Those labels were not used consistently. Roman and Greek writers often classified unfamiliar communities according to language, appearance, location, or custom. A people called Germanic by one author might be connected with the Celts by another. Modern historians cannot reconstruct the migrants' origins with complete confidence. Archaeology provides evidence for movement and contact across Central and Northern Europe, but it cannot identify every object with a named group in a literary source. The people who reached southern Gaul in the 2nd century BC may also have changed during the journey. Years of travel could bring new allies into the host, while reducing the number of those who had left the original homeland. The migration seems to have begun before Rome understood that it might become a major military problem. Ancient tradition placed the first movements in the north, where changing conditions may have made existing settlements harder to maintain. Later authors sometimes blamed floods or the encroachment of the sea. These explanations are possible, but they were written after the events and may have simplified a more complicated process. Population pressure may have contributed, as could conflict with neighbouring communities. Once movement had begun, the prospect of finding land elsewhere would have become steadily more attractive. No surviving account allows us to choose one cause with certainty. A migration of this scale did not need to begin with a single decision. Several groups could move for different reasons before joining on the road. What started as a regional displacement might gradually become an armed search for territory. By the time the migrants entered areas known to Rome, they were already capable of defeating established armies. They moved through lands occupied by communities with their own rivalries and obligations. Some resisted them. Others negotiated passage. A few may have traded supplies or joined the movement for a time. The route preserved by ancient writers is incomplete. It shifts across Central Europe and Gaul before turning toward the Roman sphere. The surviving record concentrates on battles, leaving long periods of travel almost empty. Those missing years would have contained the greater part of the migration. Most days ended without combat, beside a water source, or on ground wide enough to gather the wagons. Animals needed watching through the night. Damaged wheels had to be repaired before the column moved, and food had to be found in country already used by local farmers. The warriors protected this movement. Though they were also part of it, they did not operate at a fixed distance from the families behind them. A man who fought in the forward ranks might return after the march to a wagon containing his household and possessions. Carrying an entire population gave the host resilience, because it contained the people needed to establish new communities if land could be secured. That same arrangement made every movement more difficult. A Roman field army could survive for a limited period with standardized equipment and organized deliveries. The migrating peoples depended on a wider collection of animals, carts, stored goods, and local supplies. Their requirements changed with the season and the route. The number of people involved remains one of the largest uncertainties in the story. Ancient writers describe hundreds of thousands. Their figures may include every person in the migration, rather than only those able to fight. They may also reflect the Roman habit of enlarging the scale of a defeated enemy. A host containing more than 100,000 people is possible. A warrior count of that size is more doubtful. Even cautious estimates leave a formidable force. Tens of thousands of armed men could be present within a much larger movement. The exact total mattered less to observers than the distance the column occupied on the road. It might take hours for one section to pass a fixed point. In confined terrain, the front could reach a campsite before the rear had completed the previous stage of the journey. The coalition's strength could therefore become difficult to assemble at a single moment. That weakness was not obvious during a direct encounter. When enough warriors gathered on suitable ground, they had already shown that they could overwhelm Roman forces. Their victory at Arausio had given them weapons, supplies, and greater confidence. The battle also increased their reputation among communities farther south. Rumours described the northern warriors as unusually tall. Their tolerance of cold became proof that ordinary hardship could not affect them. Their victories were retold until military success became a form of physical invulnerability. Roman fear filled the spaces left by uncertain information. The migrants themselves continued west after Arausio. They crossed Gaul and approached the passes, leading toward the Iberian Peninsula. Ancient sources suggest that communities there resisted them, though the details are scarce. At some point, however, the movement turned back. The reasons for this reversal are unknown. The route into Spain may have proved less promising than expected. Local resistance could have limited access to land and food. The coalition may also have changed its plans after learning more about Italy and the roads leading toward it. Several years had now passed since the first reports of the migration. Children born near the beginning of the journey would have known no settled home. Older members of the host had travelled far beyond the regions, familiar to them. Objects that could not be carried or repaired had been left behind. The migration had become a way of life, though it could not continue indefinitely. Every season on the road consumed animals and supplies. Each battle removed experienced fighters. A victory might replace lost goods through plunder, but it did not create stable fields or secure winter shelter. Eventually, the coalition itself divided. The Cimbri moved toward the eastern approaches to Italy. The Teutons and Ambrones followed a route through southern Gaul. This division may have been planned as a way to enter Italy from different directions. It may also reflect separate decisions made by allied peoples that no longer wished to remain on the same road. Roman authors later presented the movement as a coordinated invasion. That interpretation suited a narrative in which Italy faced attack from two sides. The surviving evidence does not reveal how detailed the agreement actually was. For Marius, the practical result was clear enough. He would face the Teutons and Ambrones in Gaul. Another Roman command would have to watch the eastern route. The enemy approaching him still contained a large civilian population. Its warriors had reason to trust their earlier victories, though years of movement had imposed costs that Roman observers could not easily measure. Somewhere within the column was Teutobod, the king most closely associated with the Teutons in Roman accounts. Little is known about his authority before the final campaign. He may have commanded the entire people, or his influence may have depended on the support of other leaders. Ancient descriptions emphasize his extraordinary height. Such details belong partly to the Roman presentation of captured northern chiefs as impressive physical specimens. They tell us more about how Roman audiences remembered him than about how he governed. For the moment, Teutobod remained beyond Roman reach. His people were moving toward a commander who had spent years preparing to meet them. When Gaius Marius received responsibility for the Northern War, he did not inherit a simple task. The enemy's location changed from season to season. Rome could not predict which route the migrating peoples would choose. A large army had to remain ready, even while no battle appeared close. Marius was already familiar with long campaigns. He had served in Spain as a young officer and later gained distinction in North Africa. During the war against Jugurtha, he had operated in difficult country against an opponent who avoided the kind of decisive engagement Roman commanders usually preferred. That experience did not provide a complete solution for Gaul. The northern migration involved different peoples and a much larger movement. It had still taught Marius that an army could be defeated by the strain of waiting before it ever reached the battlefield. Delay also carried political danger for Marius. Marius had won the consulship for 107 BC during the Juguthine War. He returned to the office in 104 after the disaster at Arausio, then continued to be elected while the threat remained. Repeated consulships were unusual and politically controversial. Roman law and custom discouraged one man from holding the office in rapid succession. The emergency allowed voters to overlook those expectations, though it did not remove opposition to Marius. His background continued to shape that dispute. Marius came from Arpinum, a town southeast of Rome. His family possessed local standing, but it did not belong to the small group of Roman families that had supplied generations of consuls. He had entered the ruling class through military service and election. That path made him useful when Rome needed an experienced commander. It also encouraged opponents to describe him as culturally limited and socially inferior. Plutarch says that Marius showed little interest in Greek education. The description may preserve something real about his preferences, but it also reflects the values of later biographical writing. Roman aristocrats used Greek literature as a marker of cultivation. Presenting Marius as indifferent to it reinforced the image of a severe soldier who lacked refinement. His army would not be built from reputation alone. The losses at Arausio had removed a large number of experienced men. Rome still possessed other legions, allied troops, and a broad pool of citizens eligible for service. The Republic had suffered major defeats before and continued to raise armies afterward. Rome could replace bodies more quickly than it could replace experience. New recruits had to learn how to move as part of a larger formation. Officers needed enough time to understand the men under their command. Units assembled from different regions had to follow the same signals when visibility was poor. Later tradition credits Marius with transforming the Roman army during this period. The most famous claim concerns his recruitment of citizens who possessed little or no property. Ancient evidence supports the recruitment itself, though its wider significance remains disputed. Property qualifications had shaped Roman military service for centuries, but they had already changed as the Republic expanded. Poor citizens had served before Marius, especially when manpower was needed. His recruitment in 107 BC may have widened a practice that was no longer as exceptional as later writers suggested. It did not immediately create the fully professional army of the imperial period. Many of Marius's soldiers still entered service for a particular campaign. Roman allies continued to provide important contingents. Existing military customs remained in use. Marius worked within an army that was changing, and he used the available manpower without showing much concern for older social distinctions. Inside the camp, a recruit's property mattered, less than whether he could complete the work assigned to him. That work began with marching. Roman soldiers had long carried equipment, though Marius became closely associated with reducing the amount transported for them. The expression Marius's mules was later used for men who carried heavy personal loads on campaign. The exact weight cannot be reconstructed for every soldier. Equipment varied according to unit, role, and circumstance. A legionary might carry weapons, tools, food, spare clothing, and part of the material needed for camp construction. The practical purpose was straightforward. Fewer carts let the army use routes that a large baggage train could not easily follow, and reduce delays caused by broken wheels or crowded roads. Marius did not eliminate wagons. Grain, heavy equipment, medical supplies, and other necessities still required transport. An army of tens of thousands could not become independent of organized supply. What Marius reduced was the baggage he considered unnecessary. This was unlikely to make him popular with men accustomed to servants or personal comforts. The surviving sources tend to present resistance as brief, because their purpose is to demonstrate Marius's authority. In practice, changes of this kind would have required continued enforcement. The soldiers marched, then built a camp. Roman armies had constructed fortified camps long before Marius. He did not invent the ditch, rampart, or timber palisade. His contribution lay in the intensity with which he required the routine to be followed during preparation. A marching camp created security at the end of the day. It also imposed order on an army arriving tired in unfamiliar country. Each unit knew where it belonged. Guards could be assigned before darkness. Supplies could be stored within a defensible perimeter. The labor was repetitive, which was part of its value. A soldier who had performed the same task many times needed fewer instructions when the army was close to the enemy. Familiar movements reduced confusion when fatigue made careful thought more difficult. Training continued during the years when the migrating coalition remained far from Marius. Ancient narratives sometimes turn this period into a carefully designed program, in which every exercise anticipates a precise moment at Aquae Sextiae. The evidence cannot support that degree of planning. Marius did not know where the decisive battle would occur. He could not be certain that the Teutons would approach his sector at all. His preparations were intended to produce an army capable of responding once reliable information arrived. This required money from Rome and cooperation from communities in the region. Food had to reach the camps in sufficient quantities. Weapons needed repair, sick men required care, and replacement animals had to be found when existing ones failed. The RHE provided a major route into southern Gaul, though navigation near its mouth could be difficult. Shifting channels and deposits of silt made access uncertain for larger vessels. Marius ordered the construction of a canal, connecting the river system more directly with the sea. It became known as the Fossa Mariana. The work was substantial. Soldiers participated in digging it, giving them employment during a period without battle. The canal also helped merchants and supply ships reach the Roman position more reliably. Later accounts naturally connect the project with Marius's military foresight. It did support his forces, but it should not be treated as a hidden device that decided the coming battle. Armies in Gaul had drawn supplies from several routes, and the canal remained useful after the campaign ended. Its importance lay in reducing uncertainty. A commander waiting for an enemy could not allow his own army to consume local resources until the surrounding region was exhausted. Better access by water allowed Marius to remain in place without dispersing his soldiers in a constant search for food. The months passed. Reports continued arriving from beyond Roman-controlled territory. Some proved accurate, others recycled old rumors, or confused one migrating group with another. Marius could not respond to every story. He kept the army together, while scouts and allied communities watched the roads. The soldiers continued their routine, as political opponents in Rome questioned how long the emergency would last. No major victory could justify the expense, because no decisive battle had yet occurred. For Marius, that absence was preferable to another Arausio. When firmer information finally arrived, it indicated that the migrating coalition had separated. The Cimbri were moving toward another route. The Teutons and Ambrones were approaching southern Gaul. The long preparation was finally moving toward contact. The men who would soon watch the migration pass beyond their palisade had already spent months carrying equipment and building camps. Most had never faced the Teutons. Their knowledge of them came from stories shaped by the defeat at Arausio. Marius could prepare their bodies for the campaign ahead. The sight of the enemy would test whether he had also prepared them to wait. Waiting became the central fact of the Roman campaign. For much of the time after Marius reached southern Gaul, the enemy remained beyond direct contact. Reports placed the migrating peoples in different regions, sometimes separated by distances that would have required weeks of marching. A message could already be outdated when it arrived. The Roman army still had to behave as though movement might be ordered at any time. A normal day in camp probably began before the heat settled over the lower Arachne. Guards completing the final watch returned from the rampart as other soldiers prepared for work. Grain was issued and ground by hand. Equipment was inspected because a damaged strap or loose sandal could disable a man during a long march. Training occupied part of the morning. Although no source preserves a daily schedule, and ancient writers often describe preparation in ideal terms, the underlying activities are more secure. Soldiers practiced with weapons, marched under load, and repeated the work needed to establish a fortified camp. Many of the exercises would have seemed ordinary to veterans. Their difficulty came from repetition. Marius could not recreate the pressure of a real battle. He could make common actions familiar enough that exhaustion would not immediately destroy order. A soldier who had dug the same kind of ditch many times was less likely to wait for detailed instructions when the army halted near an enemy. Beyond training, the camp itself required constant maintenance. Dry weather could split exposed timber, and rain caused earthworks to settle. Latrines had to be moved or cleared before they contaminated the ground. Animals needed space away from stored grain, and access to water remained controlled. Ancient narratives say little about these tasks because they were not considered remarkable. A commander was judged more often by battles than by the condition of a camp after several quiet months. For the men living inside the defences, such maintenance filled much of the day. The Roman position drew supplies from the surrounding region and from routes connected with the Rhne. Local communities contributed through agreements that may not always have been voluntary. Merchants also followed the army, bringing goods that official distribution did not provide. The presence of tens of thousands of soldiers changed the surrounding economy. Grain prices could rise, grazing land became harder to find, and a town that welcomed Roman protection might still resent the demands placed on its stores. Marius needed the army concentrated, though concentration increased the pressure on local resources. The canal, later called the Fossa Mariana, helped ease part of this problem. It connected the Rhne more effectively with the Mediterranean near the river's mouth, where navigation could be obstructed by shallow channels and shifting deposits. The surviving accounts credit Marius with ordering the work and employing soldiers in its construction. They do not preserve a complete engineering record, so the exact route and schedule remain debated. The canal was probably designed to serve more than one purpose. It improved the movement of supplies and later benefited commercial traffic. For the soldiers assigned to dig it, the purpose may have seemed less important than the labour. The ground near the delta could be wet and difficult. Excavated soil had to be removed before the sides collapsed back into the channel. Tools wore down, and progress would have varied according to the conditions. The work kept the army occupied with a useful task during a period when no enemy appeared. It also made clear that their commander expected physical effort, even when no battle was in sight. Some recruits probably arrived believing military service consisted mainly of combat. Months in Gaul corrected that impression. Much of a soldier's life involved carrying material from one place to another. Time was spent repairing what weather and news had damaged. Routine, however, did not eliminate fear. Information about the northern peoples continued to circulate through the camp. Stories from Arausio were repeated by men who had heard them from survivors. Merchants added descriptions collected along the roads of Gaul. The Teutons were said to be taller than ordinary men. Their ability to endure cold became more impressive with each retelling. Some stories gave them habits that ancient authors associated broadly with northern peoples. Even when there was no evidence that the particular custom belonged to this migrating group, Marius could not prevent such accounts from spreading. He may not have tried. Fear of an unseen enemy was natural after Arausio. The problem was that no soldier could compare the rumours with direct observation. Until the Teutons appeared, they existed in the Roman imagination, mainly as the people who had destroyed two armies. Discipline could control a soldier's actions more easily than it could control his expectations. The long delay placed strain on officers as well. Centurions had to enforce standards during a campaign that seemed to contain no clear movement toward battle. Punishment alone could not sustain attention indefinitely. Men needed to believe that the work had a purpose, even when Marius could not tell them where the enemy was. Pressure also reached Marius from Rome. His continued election to the consulship depended partly on the unresolved threat. Supporters could argue that replacing him would waste the preparation already completed. Opponents could suggest that the danger had been exaggerated to prolong his command. The surviving sources describe political hostility in broad terms. They do not give a reliable account of every debate in the Senate during these years, though claims that the entire aristocracy opposed him simplify a more divided political situation. Some senators supported the resources the campaign required. Others may have distrusted Marius, while still accepting that he was the most experienced commander available. Without a battle, both positions could continue side by side. Marius answered political uncertainty by maintaining readiness in Gaul. He did not need every man in Rome to admire him. He needed supplies to arrive and his authority over the army to remain intact. Scouts moved north and west from the Roman positions. Allied communities sent information about roads and river crossings. Travelers were questioned when they entered territory controlled by Rome. Much of that intelligence was necessarily incomplete. A migrating host could change direction without issuing an announcement. Reports might confuse the Cimbri with the Teutons, or attach the name of a large people to smaller groups moving nearby. Numbers were especially unreliable, because observers often estimated from the length of a column. In the spring of 102 BC, the information became more consistent. The coalition had separated. The Cimbri were moving toward the eastern Alpine region. The Teutons and Ambrones were approaching the lower Rhine and the routes leading through southern Gaul. The Roman army now prepared for closer contact. Weapons underwent another inspection. Food was gathered for movement beyond the established base, and officers reviewed the order in which units would leave if scouts reported the enemy nearby. There was still no certainty about where battle would occur. Marius could choose his own camp. He could decide which roads his army used. He could not compel the migrants to appear at a specific place. The soldiers understood that the years of preparation were approaching their test. Sentries began to watch the northern approaches with greater attention. Dust on a distant road could be caused by merchants or livestock. Each report was checked before the camp reacted. Then the signs changed. Scouts returned with descriptions of a movement too large to be mistaken for a local caravan. Armed groups were advancing beside wagons. The road behind them was crowded, far beyond the first visible body of warriors. The Teutons had finally reached the Roman position. After years of rumours, the enemy was close enough to hear. The Roman camp had been placed on defensible ground near the route south. Its exact location remains uncertain. Plutarch gives the clearest surviving account of the encounter. But he was writing about 2 centuries later, and was more interested in Marius than in reconstructing the geography of every camp. The basic sequence is clear. The Teutons approached in great numbers. They did not immediately begin a formal siege. Their column continued along the road, while armed men moved close to the Roman defences. From behind the palisade, the soldiers saw the first groups pass. Equipment taken in earlier campaigns appeared among the migrants. A Roman-made shield might have reached the column through plunder or trade, while other weapons reflected different regional traditions. No ancient inventory survives, and the Teutons should not be imagined as a uniformly equipped army. Their clothing was probably just as varied. Roman writers often reduced northern peoples to a few familiar features, especially height and long hair. Such descriptions may preserve real differences in appearance, though they also helped create a recognizable foreign enemy for Roman readers. What mattered to the soldiers on the wall was the physical presence of people they had previously known only through stories. The column contained formidable men, but signs of strain were visible among them. Wagons did not move at the same pace. Animals stopped or pulled away from the road. Groups became separated when the ground narrowed. Even without disorder, the host required time to pass. In Plutarch's account, the movement continued for 6 days. The number may have been rounded for effect. Ancient authors often used the duration of a passing army to communicate size, when an exact count was impossible. Whether the column took precisely 6 days or somewhat less, it remained in view long enough for the experience to become part of camp routine. At first, the Romans could only observe. Marius had forbidden them to leave the defences and begin a battle. Plutarch presents this as a deliberate effort to familiarise the soldiers with the enemy. He says that Marius allowed his men to look at the Teutons from protected positions until their fear began to lessen. The broad account is plausible, but it does not support the elaborate psychological program sometimes built around it. Marius knew that rumour had magnified the enemy. Direct observation could correct some of the exaggeration. The soldiers would still respect what they saw, but the Teutons were no longer an invisible force defined entirely by Arausio. Guard shifts continued while the migration remained on the road. Men who watched in the morning returned to their units, and their replacements climbed the rampart to find the road still occupied. By afternoon, entirely different sections of the migration could be passing the same point. The Teutons also watched the Romans. Their warriors came near enough to call toward the camp. According to Plutarch, they asked whether the soldiers had messages for their wives, since the migrants expected to reach Italy before them. The remark may have changed during transmission. Ancient historians often preserved insults because they gave a battle narrative a sharper personal edge. It is still likely that some form of taunting occurred. The Teutons had reason to interpret Roman silence as hesitation. They had defeated Roman forces before. Marius possessed a fortified camp and a sizable army. Yet he refused to come out. From the road, the decision could look like fear. Some Romans inside the defences may have reached the same conclusion. They had trained for combat and now watched an enemy pass within reach. Men who could see isolated groups near the defences might believe that a sudden attack would succeed. They could not see the entire column or judge how quickly reinforcements would arrive. Marius had to make decisions from a wider view. The Teutons were still moving as a large connected host. Their warriors could gather in open ground, while the Romans would have to leave a prepared camp to meet them. A victory gained against one exposed group might draw the legions farther from the defences before the scale of the response became clear. There was also no urgent need to stop the column at that point. The migrants were travelling south, but they had not yet crossed into Italy. Their movement placed pressure on their own supply and gradually extended the distance between different sections of the host. Marius allowed this process to continue. He did not know exactly where the separation would become useful. The later battle near Aquae Sextiae can make his earlier decisions appear more certain than they were. In reality, he was balancing several possibilities, while the enemy moved past him. Several outcomes remained possible. The Teutons could turn against the camp, continue south without offering favourable ground, or spread out far enough for Marius to follow and confront only part of the movement. The defences gave Marius time to wait for evidence. Inside the camp, discipline was tested in a form that left little room for individual judgment. A soldier assigned to guard the wall could watch an enemy warrior approach, and still be forbidden to throw a weapon. He could hear laughter from the road without responding. His task was to remain in place until relieved. The sources do not record widespread disorder among the Romans during these days. That silence does not prove that every man obeyed calmly. There may have been arguments within units or soldiers who shouted back despite orders. What can be said with confidence is that the army did not rush out as a whole. Marius retained control. As the days passed, observation became more practical. Soldiers could identify which groups carried shields and which travelled beside wagons. They saw how the armed men were distributed through the migration, rather than concentrated in a single continuous formation. The sound also became familiar. A large moving population produced constant noise. Wheels struck uneven ground. Animals had to be driven back toward the road. Warriors close to the camp raised their voices, while those farther away blended into the broader movement. The Roman camp followed a different rhythm. Orders determined when gates opened. Guards occupied assigned positions. Food distribution continued while the enemy remained outside. The contrast did not prove that one side possessed courage and the other lacked it. It showed that they had come to Gaul in different forms. Marius's force was a field army. The Teutons, by contrast, were protecting a people on the move. Their greater total number could be powerful in battle, though the entire population could not enter a formation at once. The road itself limited how quickly warriors from distant sections could reach the front. This was the weakness Marius hoped to use, though the opportunity had not yet appeared. Plutarch does not describe a council in which the Roman commander explained his full reasoning to the officers. Later retellings often invent such a scene, because it gives strategy a clear voice. Marius may have discussed the situation with senior men. Any exact speech would be reconstruction. The actions that followed provide enough evidence. The gates remained closed except for controlled movement. The army stayed behind its earthwork. Scouts continued to track the road beyond the visible portion of the migration. Eventually, the density of the column began to diminish. More space appeared between passing groups. Wagons and livestock remained on the road, but the heavy concentration of warriors near the Roman camp moved farther south. The final sections came into view and then continued beyond the position. When the road was quiet again, the Roman soldiers were left with dust, discarded material, and the marks of thousands of feet. The enemy had passed without forcing them into battle. The Teutons had gained more distance toward Italy. Marius had gained something less visible, but equally useful. His men had stood within sight of the people who had dominated Roman fears since Arausio. They had watched them closely and remained under orders. The experience did not guarantee that the army would hold during combat, though it removed some of the uncertainty that had surrounded the enemy. Marius allowed the soldiers a period of rest, while scouts confirmed the direction of the migration. Then the Roman camp began to change. Equipment was packed, units assembled in marching order, and material that could not be carried was either stored or abandoned according to its value. The army left the position and followed the Teutons south. It did not march directly in the center of the migrants' track. Marius used routes that allowed his force to move without becoming trapped behind the wagon column. The precise path is not preserved, and later descriptions may give him more knowledge of the country than he actually possessed. Roman scouts and local guides would have been essential. The distance between the two forces was close enough for contact to remain possible, though neither side yet knew how the first fighting would begin. Aquae Sextiae lay ahead. Its springs made the area a natural stopping place. The surrounding ground also created limits on where a large migration could camp and obtain water. Marius followed with an army that had spent years learning to wait. The next encounter would begin, because waiting was no longer possible. The Roman army left its camp after the last part of the migration had disappeared along the southern road. For several days, the Teutons had controlled the pace of events simply by continuing to move. Marius now began to reduce the distance between them. The Romans did not need to follow directly behind the wagons. Scouts and local guides could identify nearby tracks that crossed the same country. Some routes would have been unsuitable for carts, though trained infantry could still use them. No source preserves the exact path. Later accounts can make Marius seem certain of where the Teutons would stop, but even good local intelligence would still have required decisions from one day to the next. The Roman column was much smaller than the migration ahead. Perhaps 30 or 40,000 soldiers marched under Marius, accompanied by allied troops, animals, servants, and necessary baggage. This remained a large body of people. It was easier to control than a migrating host carrying entire households. Orders moved through a familiar chain of command, and units could leave at fixed intervals to reduce congestion on narrow roads. When the front halted, word could pass rearward before the column folded into itself. The Teutons faced a different problem. Their leading warriors might already be searching for a campsite, while carts farther back were still crossing ground covered earlier that morning. One damaged wheel could delay every wagon behind it. Livestock wandered according to hunger rather than military necessity. These difficulties did not make the migration helpless. Years on the road had taught its people how to repair equipment and organize large movements. The column had crossed distances that many Roman soldiers would never travel in their entire lives. Its size imposed limits that experience could only reduce. Marius followed at a distance that allowed his scouts to maintain contact without drawing the army into a sudden attack. Dust rising above the road helped reveal the movement during dry hours. Scattered fires may have marked the position of camps, extending over a wide area. The Romans could not assume that every fire belonged to the main host. Smaller groups went ahead in search of water or food, while others stayed behind to recover animals that had strayed from the column. Every report therefore required interpretation. The soldiers marched through country shaped by low ridges and river valleys. Late summer heat would have made the load increasingly uncomfortable as the day advanced. Armor warmed under the sun, while dust settled onto skin already marked by sweat. Rest came only when the army reached ground suitable for a camp. The routine established during the long delay now became useful. Men who had spent months resenting the same labor could complete it before darkness. The ditch did not need to become an impressive permanent defense. It needed to discourage a sudden attack while the army slept. Food was prepared after the position had been secured. Most soldiers ate grain in forms that could be produced with limited equipment. The evening meal also depended on whatever could be obtained locally or carried from earlier supply points. An army following a migration could not rely on finding untouched stores along the road. The Teutons had passed first. Villages near their route may already have surrendered grain or hidden what they could. Fields could be stripped before the Romans arrived. Wells used by thousands of people might refill slowly. Water became an increasing concern as the two forces approached Aquae Sextiae. The settlement had been founded by the Romans more than 20 years earlier and took its name from Gaius Sextius Calvinus. Its springs made the place known in the region. The later city of Aiax in Provence would grow near the same general location. The battlefield cannot be placed with precision on a modern map. Ancient descriptions mention elevated ground, wooded areas, and water below the Roman position. Several locations around Aiax have been proposed, though none can be confirmed from the literary evidence alone. Marius did not need a perfect map. He needed a place where his army could camp without being surrounded, and where the migrating host could not bring all its numbers into action at once. The Romans reached the area, while part of the enemy remained separated from the main body. The Ambrones appear to have been among the groups nearest Aquae Sextiae. Roman authors identify them as allies of the Teutons, though they provide little reliable information about their origin or political organization. They had fought at Arausio and were remembered as dangerous warriors. Their camp lay closer to the available water, probably on lower ground. Fires appeared across the area as people prepared food after the march. Animals were gathered near the wagons, and armed men moved between family groups. The larger Teutonic host was nearby, though its full strength may not yet have been concentrated around the same camp. Marius established the Roman position on higher ground. Plutarch says the Romans occupied strong ground that lacked easy access to water. This decision has sometimes been described as a deliberate attempt to force the soldiers into battle. That interpretation depends heavily on a dramatic remark, later attributed to Marius. The ground itself allows a simpler explanation. The safer position happened to be less convenient. Moving closer to the water would also have brought the Romans closer to the Ambrones before the camp was secure. The soldiers began their familiar work while thirsty from the march. Stakes came off the baggage train, and men broke earth along the chosen defensive line. Soldiers carrying shields and tools moved into assigned places while guards watched the lower ground. From the slope, they could see water within reach. The enemy was beside it. Complaints reached Marius, or at least that is how Plutarch presents the scene. He pointed toward the water and told the soldiers that it could be obtained at the price of blood. The line fits the image later writers created of him. It may preserve a real exchange, though its polished form probably belongs to literary retelling. Even then, Marius did not order an immediate attack. Securing the camp came first. As the defences took shape, the two forces remained close enough to hear one another. The Romans had followed the migration for days without beginning a major fight. The Ambrones below may have assumed that evening would pass in the same way. For the moment, neither army formed for battle. The men on the slope continued digging. People in the lower camp ate near the river and recovered from the road. Between them lay the water both sides required. Before the Roman camp was fully settled, people began moving downhill to collect it. The first battle at Aquae Sextiae started without a formal command. The people who descended from the Roman position were probably camp servants and animal handlers. Plutarch describes them as slaves who went down to obtain water. Other non-combatants may have accompanied them, carrying jars or leather containers needed by the men working above. No source gives their number. They would not have looked like a battle formation. Some may have carried knives or tools, though they were not equipped to face a large group of warriors. The route led from the rising Roman camp toward water already being used by the Ambrones. The first moments of contact remain unclear. Plutarch tells the story briefly. The servants encountered the enemy, fighting began, and soldiers from both sides entered the clash. He does not identify the person who struck first. Later reconstruction often fills the gap with an argument followed by shoving. That sequence is possible, but no source preserves it. Threats may have started the encounter, or one group may simply have tried to drive the other away from the bank. A thrown object could have been enough. Once someone was injured, the servants turned back toward the Roman slope. Their containers were dropped or carried away during the retreat. Voices from below warned the nearest guards that something had gone wrong. The Ambrones nearby responded quickly. Many were resting after the march. Plutarch says they had been eating when the disturbance began. Men reached for weapons and moved toward the river without waiting for the entire group to assemble. The servants were already close enough to make an immediate response possible. From the camp above, the first movement may have been difficult to understand. People were running uphill while armed men followed from the lower ground. Dust and uneven terrain would have hidden parts of the encounter. Roman soldiers nearest the gate began moving to assist. The Ligurians were among them. These troops came from communities in northwestern Italy and the neighbouring coastal region. Roman authors sometimes present them as naturally suited to rough country, though such descriptions can turn regional reputation into a fixed military characteristic. Their presence in the first response is preserved by Plutarch. As the Ligurians approached, the Ambrones shouted their own name as a battle cry. The sound carried across the lower ground. The Ligurians answered by shouting the same name. Ancient writers explained this by claiming that the Ligurians had once called themselves Ambrones. That connection is uncertain and may have been invented after the battle to explain the exchange of cries. The effect on the scene is easier to imagine than its linguistic history. For a moment, the same name came from both sides. Then the groups met near the water. The first clash lacked the space required for an orderly deployment. Some men stood on the bank, while others were still descending toward it. The Ambrones arriving from their meal did not form one complete line. Roman soldiers coming from the camp entered in groups, according to how quickly they had armed themselves. The ground shaped the fighting. Near the water, loose soil and worn paths reduced secure footing. Men who stepped into the shallows found movement slowed by the riverbed. Those behind continued pressing forward without seeing exactly what was happening at the front. Shields struck before most weapons found room to move. The fighting spread along the bank. A more cinematic reconstruction gives Marius precise control over every reinforcement and every moment. The surviving evidence does not. He may have directed additional troops once the scale of the clash became clear, but officers near the gate probably controlled much of the opening response. Marius had to prevent the encounter from drawing his entire army downhill without order. He also could not allow the Ligurians and camp servants to be overwhelmed in sight of the unfinished defences. Additional Roman troops now began leaving the camp. Their arrival changed the balance near the water. The Ambrones who had rushed forward now faced soldiers descending in organised bodies. Men at the rear of the Ambrone group continued arriving, but the available frontage remained limited. Numbers accumulated behind the fighting, instead of entering it at once. The Ambrones had a reputation for confidence in close combat. Many had survived years of migration and earlier battles against Roman armies. They did not withdraw when the first Roman reinforcements appeared. The pressure increased. Plutarch's account emphasizes the shouting of the Ambrones and the determination of the Ligurians. It offers little information about weapons or formation. Later reconstructions often supply details from general knowledge of Roman combat. But none can tell us how every part of this particular clash unfolded. The Roman soldiers probably used the equipment they normally carried, A large volley of heavy javelins is unlikely once the fight had become mixed at close range. Shields and swords would have been more practical. Where friendly troops stood only a few steps from the enemy, the Ambrones used whatever weapons they had brought from the camp. Their equipment was probably less uniform. Spears and longer blades may have been present beside captured Roman arms. The line shifted away from the water. This movement may have begun gradually. A few Ambrones at the front gave ground when Roman reinforcements arrived. Those behind them were forced to adjust before they understood why the men ahead were moving back. Retreat was especially difficult beside the river. A man stepping backward could lose balance at the edge of the bank. Someone falling in shallow water became an obstacle to the next rank. The crowd behind had little room to move around him. The Romans continued forward as their numbers near the clash increased. Marius may now have ordered a broader advance. The sources describe the Ambrones being driven from the river and pursued toward their camp. They do not preserve a signal or exact sequence of commands. Once the withdrawal began, the scattered nature of the Ambrone response became dangerous. Men who had entered at different times now tried to leave by different paths. Some went directly toward the wagons, while others moved along the bank before turning away from the Romans. The fighting reached the edges of the lower camp. People who had not taken part in the first clash now saw their warriors returning under pressure. Families moved between wagons, while others tried to bring weapons forward. Animals reacted to the noise and added to the congestion. Roman troops entered an area they had not expected to attack that day. The risk of losing order increased with every step away from the hill. A pursuit through tents and wagons could break units into small groups. The main body of the Teutons remained capable of arriving. Marius ended the advance before it became a general assault on the whole migration. No source fixes the stopping point, but the Romans had achieved enough. The Ambrones near the water were defeated, and access to the river was no longer immediately contested. Ancient casualty figures for the encounter are uncertain. Later retellings sometimes claim that tens of thousands of Ambrones died during this first battle. The surviving evidence does not support an exact total. The losses were serious. Bodies remained near the bank and along the route toward the lower camp. Wounded men were brought back by both sides when the fighting allowed it. Some of the missing may have returned only after darkness, having fled farther than they intended. Roman troops had also suffered casualties. Plutarch's interest lies in the victory, so he gives little attention to their number. The Ligurians who entered first probably carried a large share of the early losses. Camp servants caught near the water would have had little protection. By late day, Roman soldiers controlled the approach to the river. Water could finally be carried uphill. Men who had spent the earlier hours digging now drank near companions returning from combat. The camp still required guards because the wider threat had not disappeared. Below the hill, the surviving Ambrones reorganized among the wagons. Their defeat had begun with an encounter. Neither commander appears to have ordered. It had separated them from part of the strength they expected to share with the Teutons. Marius had won the first engagement. The main Teutonic host was still waiting nearby. The Roman army returned to its position above the valley as daylight faded. Units counted the men who had come back. Weapons were collected where possible, and the wounded were placed inside the defences. Across the lower ground, the migration absorbed the news. A group that had marched confidently past the earlier Roman camp had now been driven away from the water. The Teutons still possessed enough warriors to seek a larger battle. The larger battle did not begin immediately. For a short time, both sides remained close to the ground, where the first blood had been shed, listening for movement from the other camp. The first battle had ended, but the campaign remained unresolved. Roman soldiers returned uphill carrying wounded men and equipment recovered near the river. Some walked without shields. Others supported companions whose injuries made the climb slow. Above them, the Roman camp was still incomplete. Sections of the ditch required further work, and several parts of the palisade had not reached their intended height. Men who had fought beside the water now resumed tasks interrupted by the alarm. The order may seem severe, though the danger had increased since morning. The Ambrones had been pushed away from the river, but the larger Teutonic force remained nearby. A weak point in the Roman defences could invite an attack after sunset, or before the next formation was ready. Marius reinforced the guards along the approaches. He also needed to learn how far the pursuit had gone, and whether Roman units had become separated near the lower camp. Officers counted the men returning through each gate. The results would have remained uncertain until stragglers arrived. The Roman dead were recovered when this could be done safely. Ancient sources offer no reliable casualty total for the first encounter. The number was probably modest compared with the main battle to come, though the loss would have felt larger within the units that reached the river first. The Ligurians had carried much of the opening fight. Their wounded required treatment inside the camp. Roman military medicine could clean injuries, remove damaged tissue, and bind wounds, but infection remained a constant danger. A man who survived the first evening might still die days later. Water was finally brought up the slope in larger quantities. The irony would have been clear to everyone. The effort to obtain it had started the battle, and the victory now allowed the camp to use the river under guard. Animals were watered after the immediate needs of the wounded and working soldiers had been met. Containers moved between the river and the camp until darkness made the route less secure. Below the Roman position, the surviving Ambrones returned to their people. The lower camp had changed since morning. Wagons had been pulled closer together in some areas. Armed men gathered around routes leading toward the Roman hill. Families searched for relatives who had entered the fight and failed to return. No surviving account records how the Teutonic leaders reacted. They may have blamed the Ambrones for beginning battle before the main force was prepared. They may also have viewed the defeat as a temporary reverse caused by surprise and difficult ground. The Romans had not destroyed the entire Ambrone contingent. Many warriors remained capable of fighting. The main body of the Teutons had not yet tested itself against Marius's legions. A much larger engagement was therefore still possible. Plutarch describes women from the migrating camp attacking men who fled back from the river. According to his account, they struck at both fugitives and pursuing Romans. The episode requires caution. Ancient writers often emphasized the ferocity of northern women when describing battles against migrating peoples. Women did sometimes defend wagon camps, especially when defeat threatened the survival of the entire community. The full scale of their involvement after the river fight cannot be reconstructed. Some fighting near the wagons remains entirely plausible. Roman pursuers entering the edge of the camp would have encountered people protecting children, animals, and possessions. Ambrone warriors trying to escape through the same space could create anger among those who believed the camp had been exposed by their retreat. Whatever happened there, the Romans withdrew before darkness. Marius had no reason to continue fighting among wagons without knowing where the rest of the enemy stood. The slope above offered security and a clearer position for the next day. Beyond the immediate victory, the engagement had revealed something important. The migration was no longer moving as one uninterrupted column. The Ambrones had fought before the Teutons could place their full strength beside them. Distance and local terrain had separated allied groups that had appeared inseparable on the road. Marius could recognize the advantage without having planned the river clash. Later retellings often make every development part of a design prepared long in advance. The evidence supports a more restrained conclusion. Marius chose defensible ground and kept control of his army, but the opening battle began unexpectedly. His achievement was preventing it from widening beyond control. That evening, Roman officers reviewed the units available for another engagement. Where possible, weapons lost near the river were replaced. Damaged shields were repaired with material already in camp, and usable javelins were collected from the ground after the pursuit. No special modification of the Roman pilum should be connected with this battle. Plutarch associates Marius's famous wooden fastening with the later battle against the Cimbri at Vercelli in 101 BC. It does not belong securely in the account of Aquae Sextiae. The soldiers facing the Teutons carried ordinary Roman weapons. Their advantage lay in the condition of the army and the position it occupied. Food was distributed after the camp had been secured. Men ate near their units, while guards remained on duty. Those who had fought spent the evening describing what they had seen to companions who had remained above. The reports would not have been consistent. One soldier might insist that the ambrones broke immediately, while another remembered sustained resistance near the water. Someone who entered late could believe the enemy was already retreating when he arrived. No individual in the camp possessed a complete view. Marius knew only that his army had won the first encounter and remained under control. He also knew that success could create carelessness. Soldiers who had feared the Teutons days earlier might now underestimate them after defeating one allied group. The main host still contained many thousands of warriors. Ancient accounts place its size far above the Roman army, although their figures cannot be trusted as literal totals. Even after allowing for exaggeration, Marius probably remained outnumbered. The difference mattered less on the slope than it would have on open ground. The Romans could form across the higher position while the enemy approached from below. The Teutons would have to concentrate men from a camp spread across uneven country. Marius began preparing the army for that possibility. Plutarch says he placed 3,000 men under the command of Marcus Claudius Marcellus in concealment behind the enemy. Frontinus gives a related account. Though the details do not match perfectly, the movement must have occurred before the decisive phase of the battle. Its exact timing is uncertain. Marcellus may have left the Roman camp during the night, or moved earlier under cover provided by the terrain. The force could have included light troops, allied infantry, or selected legionaries. No surviving account preserves its full composition. The soldiers remaining on the hill may not have known where the detachment had gone. Secrecy was necessary, because the maneuver depended on the Teutons concentrating against the visible Roman line. A rumour moving through the camp could reach prisoners, traders, or people passing between the armies. Marius needed the force hidden until the battle had already begun. What happened during the night is poorly documented. Some modern retellings add hours of ritual shouting, mysterious lights, and widespread terror inside the Roman camp. None of those details appears in Plutarch's account of Aquae Sextiae, and they should not be presented as historical events. Neither camp is likely to have been silent. The wounded cried out. Animals moved among the wagons. Guards called to one another in languages heard across the valley. Occasional alarms may have been raised when shapes appeared beyond the defences. Nothing in the surviving sources proves that either army spent the night in collective panic. The Romans had worked to occupy them. Men finished the defences and prepared weapons for morning. Officers checked the ground where each unit would form. Scouts watched the lower camp for signs of movement. Across the valley, the Teutons gathered after the Ambrone defeat. They now faced a choice. Continuing south would leave a Roman army close behind them. Attacking meant advancing toward troops already established on higher ground. Their leaders chose battle. At some point before morning, the decision moved through the migrating camp. Warriors prepared shields and weapons. Groups that had been separated along the road gathered near the chosen approach. Their families remained behind among the wagons. For years they had travelled behind men who had defeated local communities and Roman armies. Now the road into Italy passed close to a hill occupied by Marius. The next fight would no longer begin over water. Both sides knew it was coming. Morning revealed two armies preparing on different levels of the same ground. The Romans formed above the valley. Their exact arrangement has not survived. Marius probably placed the main heavy infantry where the slope allowed units to support one another without becoming crowded. Allied troops occupied parts of the line according to their equipment and experience. The camp remained behind them. Its gates gave access to stored weapons and water. The defences also provided a place for wounded men and non-combatants, while the army stood outside. Below, the Teutons assembled in greater numbers than the Ambrones had brought to the river. The process took time. Warriors emerged from different sections of the migration and moved toward the hill. Some carried shields marked by years of travel. Others used captured equipment or weapons made along the route. The Ambrone survivors may have joined them. Ancient accounts do not explain how the allied groups were arranged during the main battle. They concentrate on the Teutons, because their defeat became the central Roman victory. Teutobod was probably present near the army, though his precise location is unknown. Later descriptions turn him into a towering figure visible above the people around him. Such an image suited his eventual display as a captive. It cannot tell us whether he fought in the front or directed the approach from farther back. From the Roman line, identifying individual leaders would have been difficult. The soldiers saw movement spreading across the lower ground. Sound reached them before the nearest groups came within weapon range. Shields struck against bodies and equipment. Orders passed through the crowd in words most Romans could not understand. Marius kept the Roman line in place. The enemy had to approach uphill, though the incline should not be imagined as a sheer climb. An army could advance over it in formation. The cost appeared gradually as distance and heat took effect. Plutarch says Marius arranged the battle so that the sun and dust troubled the Teutons. The claim is possible, although later writers often credited successful commanders with using every feature of nature deliberately. The direction of the sunlight cannot be reconstructed with confidence, because the exact battlefield is unknown. Dust was more certain. Thousands of feet, crossing dry ground, would raise it above the lower ranks. Men approaching the hill saw less clearly as those ahead disturbed the surface. The Romans on higher ground would also be affected once the wind carried dust toward them. The Teutons continued forward. Their earlier victories had shown that a strong charge could break Roman troops. At Arausio, Roman command failures had allowed the migrating warriors to attack divided forces. The men now climbing toward Marius may have expected another line to give way under direct pressure. The Romans had spent years preparing for the moment when retreat would become difficult. Centurions stood within the ranks, rather than watching from safety behind them. Their task was to preserve intervals and prevent men from moving forward before the order arrived. As the distance closed, the first missiles were thrown. The surviving accounts do not describe the volleys in detail. Roman heavy javelins had a limited effective range, and soldiers needed enough space to throw without striking men in front of them. A volley thrown downhill could damage shields and injure exposed warriors, but missiles alone would not stop an army of this size. Some Teutons raised shields and continued climbing. Others moved around men who had fallen. Gaps opened and closed as groups adjusted their pace. The Roman line prepared for contact. There was no exact countdown. Officers judged the distance, while noise and dust made signals harder to read. Units may have released missiles at slightly different moments. Then the first Teutons reached the upper part of the slope. The collision did not occur everywhere at once. One section of the Roman line met attackers, while men farther along still watched the enemy approach. Local pressure varied according to the ground, and the density of the groups climbing toward them. Roman shields absorbed the first impact. The men behind the front rank pressed forward enough to support it, without removing all room for movement. Soldiers used swords where openings appeared around shields and arms. The Teutons tried to force the line backward through weight and repeated attacks. Their warriors were not an uncontrolled crowd. They had fought together before and understood how to follow leaders in close combat. Their difficulty came from the slope and from the number of men trying to reach the same frontage. Those at the rear continued moving forward without seeing the Roman line. The pressure pushed men already engaged toward the shields above them. A warrior who needed space to use a long weapon could find another man directly behind his shoulder. The Romans faced their own danger if one unit moved downhill during a moment of success. It could expose the units beside it. Pursuing too early would surrender the advantage of the higher position and pull soldiers into the greater mass below. Marius kept the line near the crest. Ancient authors praise him for maintaining discipline. though they do not preserve every command. The result suggests that Roman officers prevented a general advance during the early phase. The fighting settled into repeated local struggles. A Teutonic group reached the Roman shields and tried to open a space. Men fell or withdrew, allowing another group to approach. The Romans replaced casualties from ranks behind the front. Heat increased as the battle continued. Armor and shields limited the body's ability to cool. A man climbing under load reached contact already breathing heavily. Once engaged, he had little opportunity to recover. The Roman soldiers were also exhausted. Holding ground against repeated pressure required constant effort. Their advantage did not remove fatigue. It delayed its effects compared with the men climbing toward them. The ancient sources describe a Roman victory that eventually became overwhelming. They provide less information about the period before the Teutons broke. That silence can make the outcome seem immediate. The fighting almost certainly was not. The main host retained enough strength to continue after the first groups failed. Fresh warriors kept reaching the upper ground, and parts of the Roman line may have bent till men from behind restored them. Marius could not know whether the hidden force behind the enemy remained undiscovered. No signal from Marcellus is recorded. His detachment may have waited for an agreed moment, or he may have acted after seeing that the Teutons were fully committed to the slope. From the front, the Roman soldiers had no reason to assume help would arrive. Their attention remained on the men directly below their shields. The Teutons continued pressing toward the crest. Their rear ranks could still believe the Roman line was close to breaking, because they saw their own warriors near the top. Information moved poorly through the mass. A local success could be mistaken for progress along the entire front. A setback might remain invisible until retreating men carried it downhill. The battle reached a stage where neither side could easily disengage. The Romans had the camp behind them, though retreat through its gates under pressure would create dangerous congestion. The Teutons had thousands of their own people farther down the slope and among the wagons. The road to Italy remained beyond the Roman position. For the Teutons, victory required opening that road or removing the army following them. For Marius, the battle offered the opportunity he had waited years to receive. The enemy's warriors were now concentrated against the visible Roman line. Their attention faced uphill. Behind them, the lower ground appeared secure because the main threat stood in front. Somewhere beyond their crowded ranks, Marcellus and his men began to move. The first Romans to notice movement behind the Teutons may not have understood it at once. Dust appeared beyond the lower ranks, away from the main line on the hill. It came from ground the Teutons believed was secure. A few men turned to look while those around them continued pushing uphill. Soon armed troops emerged behind the migrating army. Plutarch identifies their commander as Marcus Claudius Marcellus, and gives the force a strength of 3,000 men. Frontinus preserves a similar maneuver, though his description differs in several details. Neither account preserves the route Marcellus followed. The detachment may have moved under cover of woodland or broken ground. It could have left the Roman position before dawn, then waited until the Teutons committed themselves to the slope. The later success of the maneuver encouraged ancient writers to describe it as carefully timed, but no surviving account preserves a signal between Marius and Marcellus. Marcellus had to judge the moment himself. If he attacked too early, the Teutons could turn part of their army against him before the uphill battle became fixed. If he waited too long, the Roman line above might break. By the time his troops appeared, most Teutonic attention faced the hill. Warriors near the front were already engaged with Marius's infantry. Those farther down continued pressing toward them. The rear contained men who expected safety behind the main body. Marcellus struck this less prepared part of the force. 3,000 men could not surround an entire migrating host. Their importance came from where they appeared. Men in the Teutonic rear now heard Roman weapons from a direction that should have been open. Some turned to meet the new attack. Others tried to move uphill, hoping the force behind them was small enough to ignore. Messages passed through a crowd already struggling to understand the battle ahead. The information became distorted as it travelled. A man near Marcellus could see that the Roman detachment was limited. A warrior several hundred steps away heard only that Romans had appeared in the rear. By the time the warning reached those near the slope, it may have sounded like a second army. The Teutons were forced to divide their attention, while already under pressure. Those closest to Marcellus began fighting on lower ground. Men between the two Roman forces had little room to reorganize. Groups attempted to face opposite directions, while others continued moving according to earlier orders. The attack on the hill began to lose momentum. Roman soldiers near the crest felt the change before they understood its cause. The pressure against their shields weakened in some sections. Teutonic warriors who had been pushing forward began looking behind them. Marius now sent the Roman line forward. The Roman line moved down from the position it had defended. It did not descend as one perfectly even body. Units advanced according to the ground before them and the resistance they faced. The first steps were careful. A soldier moving downhill could easily lose balance against an enemy below. The Romans still needed to keep enough order to avoid creating gaps between units. The Teutons were no longer able to concentrate against them. Men near the front faced Roman troops coming downhill. Those behind encountered Marcellus. The large numbers that had once seemed overwhelming now made movement harder. Ancient accounts describe a complete defeat, but give little detail about the point at which organized resistance turned into flight. That change would not have occurred everywhere at once. One group may have continued fighting, while another began moving away. A local withdrawal opened space that nearby men tried to use. The movement became faster when they saw Romans entering the gap. Behind the Teutonic ranks, there was no empty field. Their wagons and families occupied the lower ground. Animals had been gathered near temporary camps. Paths between carts were already crowded with people who had not expected the battle to reach them so quickly. Warriors leaving the slope moved toward this mass. Some still carried shields and remained capable of resistance. Others had lost weapons during the retreat. A few probably tried to form new groups around leaders they recognized. The Roman pressure continued. Marcellus's men did not need to destroy every unit they encountered. Their presence closed routes that might otherwise have allowed an orderly withdrawal. Men trying to avoid the rear attack moved toward the wagons, adding to the congestion there. The Romans advancing from the hill reached ground where the formation widened. This gave them room to pursue, though it also made control more difficult. Years of fear and the memory of Arausio would have shaped the pursuit. The officers had to keep units together, while the opportunity for a decisive victory remained open. A broken enemy could still recover if the Romans scattered among the camps in small groups. Marius had stopped the pursuit after the river battle. This time, he allowed it to continue. The main Teutonic force had already committed itself. There was no larger body nearby waiting to enter the fight in fresh order. The Cimbri were far away on another route. By then, the Roman objective had changed. During the first encounter, preserving the army mattered more than destroying the Ambrones. During the main battle, allowing the Teutons to escape would leave them capable of regrouping farther south. The pursuit therefore moved toward the wagon camp. At this stage, ancient casualty figures become especially unreliable. Plutarch gives a total of 100,000 killed or captured. Livy's summary preserves a larger number of dead. Other traditions offer totals that cannot be reconciled. No one counted the battlefield with anything resembling modern precision. Roman authors wanted the victory to appear equal to the fear that had preceded it. A defeated host of extraordinary size also increased Marius's reputation. The true losses were still severe. A retreat from a confined battlefield could kill men who had escaped the main line. Some were overtaken on the road. Others became trapped near wagons or water. Many surrendered when they found no clear route away. What began as an uphill assault had become a struggle to escape through the lower ground. Teutobod disappeared from the main field during the collapse. The sources do not agree on the exact circumstances. He may have left with a small group before the wagon camp was fully surrounded. Some accounts place his capture during the battle, while Plutarch suggests that he was taken afterward. Later Roman audiences mostly remembered the ending. Before he entered Roman custody, the people who had travelled under his leadership faced the destruction of the world they had carried south. The warriors retreating from the hill reached the wagons first. Behind them came the Romans. The wagon camp had never been designed as a permanent fortress. Its carts could be drawn together to create barriers. Narrow spaces between them could be blocked, and people familiar with the arrangement could move through passages that confused an outsider. Such defences offered protection against raiders. It was far less effective when thousands of defeated warriors arrived together with a Roman army close behind. The first fugitives carried news of disaster before anyone could give a full account. Some said the army had been attacked from behind. Others had seen only the Roman advance from the hill. Families in the camp understood the essential point. The warriors had failed to hold the road. People began moving toward wagons containing food and possessions. Animals were pulled away from open spaces. Children were gathered from areas where they had watched the distant battle. No second route had been prepared for a migration of this size. The same carts that had carried the community across Europe now limited its movement. Harnessing animals required time. Turning a loaded wagon on crowded ground could block everyone behind it. Some groups may have tried to leave before the Romans reached the camp. Others stayed because relatives were still returning from the battlefield. A family that abandoned its wagon also abandoned much of what remained from years of travel. There was no time to make that decision calmly. Roman troops approached from more than one direction. Marcellus's force had already reached parts of the lower ground, while Marius's main army came from the slope. The wagon barrier did slow the first Roman soldiers entering the camp. Fighting resumed in the spaces between carts. Teutonic warriors who had escaped the main battle used whatever cover they could find. Men without shields fought beside those who had managed to keep their equipment. Women also took part. Plutarch describes them standing on wagons and resisting the Romans with axes and other weapons. He says they struck at fleeing men from their own side before turning against the pursuers. The episode belongs to a wider ancient tradition of women defending northern wagon camps, and similar scenes appear in accounts of other migrating peoples. That does not make it fictional, but it does warn against treating every dramatic detail as eyewitness testimony. The women had immediate and practical reasons to resist. Roman victory meant captivity for anyone who remained. The prisoners could be separated from their families and sold into slavery. The wagons contained the last possessions available to people who no longer had a homeland behind them. Resistance therefore continued after the organized army had broken. The camp could not defeat Marius, but its defenders could make the final stage slower and more violent. The Romans moved through gaps opened between wagons. Some carts were pushed aside or overturned. Others became fixed barriers around which the fighting shifted. Animals crowded inside the camp added to the confusion. Horses and cattle reacted to shouting and weapons. Tethered animals pulled against ropes. Those that escaped moved through passages already crowded with people. Roman officers attempted to restore order as units entered the camp. The opportunity for plunder made discipline harder to maintain. Wagons held metalwork, clothing, food, weapons, and goods taken during earlier travels. A soldier who stopped to search could lose contact with his unit. The surviving accounts do not describe how Marius controlled this phase. Claims that the camp was cleared according to a precise schedule are later reconstruction. The process probably continued unevenly as Roman groups secured one section and then moved into another. Some defenders surrendered, others continued fighting until they were killed. Ancient authors also report that women killed children, and then themselves rather than accept captivity. These reports must be handled carefully. Mass suicide appears often in Roman descriptions of defeated foreign communities. The theme demonstrated courage, while also confirming the finality of Roman victory. Individual cases may have occurred, though the scale cannot be known. Once resistance around the wagons ended, the Romans faced a large prisoner population. Warriors who surrendered joined women and elderly people taken in the camp. The sources give totals in the tens of thousands, but none can be accepted as a dependable count. Even a much lower figure would have created an immediate problem. Prisoners required guards. Food and water had to be supplied until arrangements were made for their removal. Injured captives could slow movement, though killing them after surrender would reduce the financial value of the victory. Roman warfare treated captives as property. Some prisoners might eventually enter private households or agricultural labor. Others would be sold through markets connected with ports in southern Gaul. The fate of individual captives soon disappears from the record. Ancient historians were interested in the number captured because it measured the scale of success. They rarely followed the lives of people sold after the army moved on. For the migrants, the defeat destroyed more than their fighting force. The road south had depended on armed men protecting the wagons. Once those men were killed, scattered, or captured, the civilian population could no longer continue as an independent community. Carts and animals survived, and some families may have escaped beyond the immediate battlefield. The organized migration itself did not survive. The name of the Teutons continued in Roman memory, because Rome had defeated them. Their own account of the journey has not survived. No Teutonic writer described the years on the road, or the final view of the Roman hill. Everything that remains was preserved by outsiders. That imbalance still shapes the story. Roman sources tell us that Marius won. They preserve the Ambroan cry near the water, the attack on the slope, and the appearance of Marcellus in the rear. They cannot tell us what the migration called itself when no Roman was present. Teutobod was captured soon after the fighting ended. Plutarch describes him as a man of exceptional size who had earlier demonstrated unusual agility by leaping across several horses. Such details belong partly to biography and spectacle. A captive king needed to appear physically impressive when displayed in a Roman triumph. The place of his capture remains uncertain. He may have been found in the surrounding hills with a small group. Another tradition places him farther from the battlefield. The date may have been the following day, though the surviving chronology is not exact. His capture removed a remaining figure around whom survivors might have gathered. Marius's soldiers began counting what the victory had cost and what it had produced. Roman casualties are not reliably recorded because ancient authors devote their totals to enemy dead and prisoners. Marius's army had certainly lost men at the river, on the hill, and among the wagons. The wounded were collected from a wide area. Some lay near the Roman line where the main contact began. Others had fallen during the pursuit. Men injured within the wagon camp could be difficult to find until the fighting ended. Water was carried to those who could still drink. The dead could not all be buried immediately. A battlefield holding tens of thousands of people before the fighting would require days of work after it. The season and temperature made delay dangerous. Marius also had to send news of the victory south. Messengers left the region with reports of victory. Their first accounts were probably brief. The Teutons had been defeated. Their king was captured. The western approach toward Italy was secure. For Rome's immediate purposes, those statements were true enough. They did not, however, mean that the war was over. The Cimbri remained beyond the Alps. They had followed a different route and had not shared the disaster at Aquae Sextiae. Marius could not stay among the captured wagons indefinitely. The army needed rest and reorganization before it moved toward the next threat. Prisoners had to be transferred, while supplies recovered from the migration were sorted. The battlefield slowly became quieter. Roman guards watched the captives. Fires used for cooking and treatment appeared across ground that had held two camps. The river continued below the slope where the first encounter had begun. For years, Rome had imagined the Teutons as an approaching danger without a clear shape. Now their weapons lay in piles, and their wagons stood under Roman control. The victory had removed one part of the northern threat. Another army was still moving toward Italy. News of the victory travelled south, while the Roman army remained near Aquae Sextiae. The first message probably contained little detail. Marius had defeated the Teutons and their allies. Their migration had been broken. Teutobod was a prisoner, or would soon become one. For Rome, those facts mattered more than a precise reconstruction of the battlefield. The city had lived with the northern threat since the disaster at Arausio. Families remembered men who had not returned. Political careers had risen or collapsed around the question of who could protect Italy. Aquae Sextiae removed one approach to the Alps. Public ceremonies followed the announcement. Sacrifices thanked the gods for the victory, and Marius received the honour due to a successful commander. Later writers describe an intense reaction in Rome, although the surviving evidence does not allow every celebration or Senate decree to be reconstructed. The relief in Rome was real. It was also necessarily incomplete. The Cimbri remained in the north. They had taken a separate route and were moving toward Italy from the eastern Alpine region. Their warriors had not witnessed the defeat of the Teutons. News of it may have reached them only after the campaign had already advanced too far to reverse easily. Marius therefore could not treat Aquae Sextiae as the end of the war. The Roman army reorganized after the battle. Prisoners were placed under guard, while captured animals and supplies were collected. Equipment taken from the battlefield had to be sorted before the army moved again. Plutarch describes Marius preparing a large sacrifice from captured weapons. According to his account, a message arrived during the ceremony, announcing that he had been elected consul once more. The scene may preserve a genuine tradition. Its arrangement also suits Plutarch's interest in dramatic moments that connect military success with political fortune. Marius's repeated elections were extraordinary. He had now held the consulship in successive years while the emergency continued. His supporters could point to Aquae Sextiae as proof that the decision had been justified. Opponents had less room to challenge him, while the Cimbri remained undefeated. The following year, Marius joined the forces preparing to meet that remaining threat. At Vercelli, in 101 BC, the Cimbri were defeated. Marius shared command and credit with Quintus Lutatius Catulus, although later political rivalry affected how each man's contribution was remembered. Only after Vercelli could Rome regard the northern crisis as over. Marius returned as the most celebrated commander of his generation. Roman tradition eventually called him a third founder of the city, placing him after Romulus and Camillus, among the men believed to have saved Rome from destruction. The title belongs to the memory created after both campaigns. It should not be placed too early, or treated as a formal judgment shared by everyone. Marius remained a divisive political figure. Victory increased his influence, but it did not settle the conflicts surrounding his career. Roman elections, land distributions, military rewards, and personal rivalries continued to shape his relationship with the Senate and the people. The soldiers who had served under Marius also expected compensation. Some owned little property and depended on political decisions for land after discharge. Marius needed support in Rome to secure rewards for them. This strengthened the bond between commander and soldier, though Aquae Sextiae did not create that relationship by itself. The Roman military system, however, had been changing for many decades. Recruitment pressures, overseas campaigns, economic inequality, and longer periods of service all contributed. Marius responded to those conditions and became closely associated with them. Later events strengthened that association. Roman armies would eventually become involved in civil wars. Generals, including Sulla, Pompey, and Caesar, would rely on soldiers whose futures were connected to successful commanders. Because of what followed, it is tempting to draw a straight line from Marius's camp in Gaul to the Republic's collapse. The evidence does not justify that degree of certainty. Aquae Sextiae did not make civil war inevitable. It did not destroy republican government. The battle solved an immediate military crisis, while the political consequences of Rome's expanding armies developed through later choices made by many people. Marius himself would take part in those later conflicts. His final years were marked by rivalry, with Sulla and violence within Italy. Nothing on the hill above Aquae Sextiae reveals that future clearly. A commander can prepare for an approaching army without understanding how political struggles will change decades later. The battle's immediate meaning was simpler. A Roman army that had once feared another Arausio remained under command. It allowed the enemy to pass, followed at a controlled distance, and fought after the migration had become divided. The first engagement began unexpectedly near water. The second was decided on rising ground, where the Teutons attacked the Roman line before another force appeared behind them. The defeat then spread into the wagon camp and ended the migration as an organized power. Beyond this outline, certainty declines. The number of Romans is not securely known. The size of the Teutonic host is even harder to determine. Ancient casualty totals were shaped by celebration and the desire to present Marius as the conqueror of an immense enemy. The battlefield's exact location remains disputed. The springs of Aquae Sextiae connect the account with the area around modern AIX improvements. But no surviving marker identifies the Roman line or the route taken by Marcellus. The sequence of the two engagements is more secure than their precise timing. Ancient sources disagree about the interval between them. Later, narratives compress events or add details that make the action easier to visualize. The people defeated there left no written account that is known to us. Their intentions must be reconstructed from Roman and Greek authors, who saw them as a threat. Those writers preserved valuable information, though their perspective remained that of the victors. They called the movement an invasion. For many of the people among the wagons, it had also been a search for somewhere to live. Both descriptions can be true without resolving every question. An armed migration could threaten the communities along its route, while carrying families whose choices had narrowed over years of travel. Aquae Sextiae ended that search for most of them. The captives entered Roman records as numbers and property. Those who escaped disappeared into surrounding regions or joined other communities. Their names were rarely preserved. Most of the Roman dead are equally anonymous. Ancient historians remembered Marius, Teutobod, Marcellus, and the peoples who fought. The ordinary soldiers appear as units, holding a slope or descending toward a river. Their individual experiences were lost. What remains, therefore, is a story shaped by distance. Plutarch wrote long after the battle and used earlier material that no longer survives. Frontinus preserved the maneuver as an example of military strategy. Livy's account is known only through a brief summary. Each source preserved a different part of the event. Read together, they preserve enough to explain why Rome won, but not enough to replay the battle moment by moment. The ending is strongest when it stays close to what can still be established. A migrating people moved past a Roman camp because its leaders believed the army inside would not stop them. Marius followed until the ground, and the separation of the enemy reduced the danger of their greater numbers. Near Aquae Sextiae, the Romans endured the attack. By the time the fighting ended, the western road into Italy was no longer threatened by the Teutons. The Cimbri still waited beyond the mountains. Marius would march again.